Now Kenneth Feinberg, administrator of the $20 billion BP Gulf oil spill compensation fund. He spoke to the Economic Club of Washington for a little less than an hour.
We're very pleased today to have Ken Feinberg as our speaker. Ken and I have known each other for about 30 years. We both worked together on Capitol Hill. He was working in the 1970s for Senator Kennedy. I was working for Senator Birch Bayh. Ken had come to Capitol Hill after completing some time as an assistant U.S. attorney in New York and also had clerked for Chief Judge Fold in New York Court of Appeals. Ken is a native of Brockton, Massachusetts, graduate of University of Massachusetts at Amherst, NYU Law School, and after he left Senator Kennedy as the Chief of Staff of Senator Kennedy in 1980, he set up the Washington office for Kay Scholler. In that position, he was appointed by Judge Jack Weinstein, judge in the Southern District of New York, to help be a special master for the Agent Orange litigation. And Ken did such a good job in getting that resolved that he was subsequently appointed for a number of other special litigation matters as special master, for example, in the asbestos litigation and the DES contraceptive litigation. Subsequent to that, Ken started his own firm, Feinberg Company, now Feinberg Rozen, and in that position he was asked to do a number of other things in the alternative dispute resolution area, in the mediation area, until recently probably best known for having been the special master in the 9/11 compensation fund, and he did that pro bono, distributed some $7 billion to more than 5,000 members, victims or the families of the victims of the 9/11 accident and tragedy. Subsequent to that, he was appointed as a special master to help administer the Virginia Tech funds relating to those killings. And then most recently, Ken has been doing two things. One is serving as the special master relating to the compensation for those who've received, executives who received compensation under the TARP funds. And also, as I think everybody knows, he's recently appointed by BP and by the administration to help administer and serve as the administrator for the BP $20 billion fund. And in that context, Ken, I think, will make some remarks today about what he's doing in that regard. So I'm very pleased that Ken is able to be here today. Ken and I also work together on one other matter. In my capacity as the chairman of the Kennedy Center, I get the chance to work with Ken, who's also, because of his love of classical music and opera, Ken is the president of the Washington National Opera. Thank you very much for being here, Ken.
I want to thank David for the introduction. It's correct. We go back a long, long way to our days working together in the U.S. Senate. And whatever we do, whatever David does, whatever I do, nothing is as difficult as chairing the Kennedy Center and being president of the opera. I assure you, there is nothing quite like that. David's correct when he says that I've been a special master in some tough assignments. That's a legal term, special master. I once said to my wife, you know, I'm the special master for the 9/11 fund. And she said, that's fine with me, but if anybody calls me the special mistress, there's going to be trouble. You might wonder, how can we in a few minutes blend the work that I'm doing for Secretary Geithner as the special master for pay, TARP executive pay, and BP? How do you blend those two in just 20 minutes? But you can. Because if you look at both of those assignments, there is a common denominator. Every once in a while, fortunately not that often, but every once in a while there is a public policy dilemma that requires public policy makers to think out of the box. Now put aside the issue of whether or not you agree with the resolution of that public policy. Put aside the merits of whether or not a special master for pay is a good idea or a BP $20 billion fund is a good idea. Put that aside for a minute. But understand that what is unique about these assignments, Agent Orange was another one, the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund, Virginia Tech, other examples. The conventional way of resolving these dilemmas won't work. And whether it's government or the private sector, a decision is made that we better go off and try something new. It may not work, but conventional resolution won't get the job done. Now, when it comes to Treasury and pay, my job there was made easier by the fact that Congress spoke, like in the 9/11 fund. Congress spoke, and Congress said, for those 7 companies that received the most taxpayer assistance, and just those 7, somebody at Treasury ought to set their pay for the top people. For the top people. Congress delegated that assignment to the secretary, who delegated it to me. And for those 7 companies, AIG, Citigroup, Bank of America, Chrysler, Chrysler Financial, GM, and GMAC, Congress said, Treasury, Feinberg, set the pay of the top 100 officials in each of those 7 companies until they repay the taxpayer. Once they repay the taxpayer, they are out from under your thumb. So in 2009, I, at the request of the secretary, I determined and calculated the actual dollars for each of the top 25 officials in those companies. And we established a regimen of pay for officials 26 to 100 in each of those 7 companies, and only those 7 companies. I did that in 2009. Citigroup and Bank of America, for reasons you can ask them, one being to get out from under my thumb, borrowed money to repay the taxpayers so they could get out from under my jurisdiction, and they did. So in 2010, there were 5 companies. Chrysler Financial, which is in runoff, they're out from under my thumb. So today, as we meet here this morning, there are only 4 companies left. Now, I would have thought, as to that assignment, there would have been a great deal of criticism. Government regulation of private pay is none of the government's business. I would have thought that. I would have thought that would have been a big issue. Turned out to be a non-issue. Turned out to be a non-issue, I think, I've concluded, for 2 reasons. First, Feinberg's only dealing with 100-some-odd officials. I mean, what are we getting excited about? It's a sideshow. It's a rather very limited role that I'm playing. And if you really want to see impact on pay, don't look to what I'm doing, which is relatively modest. Look to the other initiatives that are out there being promoted by this administration. The Regulatory Reform Bill is about to become law. Corporate governance reform. Secretary Geithner has taken the lead on the G20 in trying to make sure that competitive pay in the United States is not disadvantaged by foreign pay. The SEC and Commissioner Shapiro with her transparency rules. Sheila Bair at the FDIC, the Federal Reserve. There's a lot more going on executive pay than my limited role. That's one reason there hasn't been a hue and cry. The other reason there hasn't been much criticism at all is because, after all, these companies survived because of the American taxpayer. So when you talk to other corporate officials, their basic approach to me is, I have no problem with what you're doing. Those companies only maintained their financial stability because the taxpayer came to the rescue. Why shouldn't they have their pay set? Don't touch my pay. But in terms of those 7 companies, why not? The taxpayer is a creditor of those companies. Why shouldn't there be some say in what these companies get paid? Now, because of that, there hasn't been a great deal of criticism. I am somewhat surprised at the degree of interest in what I'm doing. Why, if I'm only establishing pay for a very small number of people, is there such interest? Well, I think there is a reason. Again, two reasons. First, at a time of great economic uncertainty, populist fervor is very high. People are upset. Unemployment rate's high. People want to know, what are those Wall Street guys getting? It's a historical thing. It was no different in the Gilded Age or J.P. Morgan or whatever. I mean, if you look at American history, there's always a tension between Wall Street and Main Street. And what you find at this time in America, because of economic uncertainty, people are focused on pay more than they might otherwise be. The second reason is a very practical one. I'm the only fellow in government who takes rather vanilla prescriptions about pay and actually calculates to the penny what somebody ought to make. And that, I think, allows people to hone in not on, well, it's very important that compensation be tied to performance. You know, what else is new? But, and that means that this person should make 800,000 or 1.8 million or 3 million or 600,000. For that reason, there tends to be a good deal of focus. Now, the one remaining issue I've still got to deal with within the next week or so, under the statute, I've got to look back at what 419 companies received in terms of TARP assistance. How much bonus money did they give out? And should there be an effort under the statute to try and recoup some of those funds? And that project's been underway now for about 3 months. It involves 419 companies, not just the 7. This is a purely voluntary program. I can't enforce efforts to recoup money. The question is, should I try and get any of it back from 2 years ago? We're finishing up that look back, and those decisions will be rendered by me sometime, I think, within the next week or so. There's been some interest among 419 companies as to whether there'll be an effort to recoup any of those dollars or impose any other, or voluntarily suggest any other remedial steps to prevent excessive bonuses going forward. So that's pay. And what makes the pay assignment so interesting is its uniqueness. The assignment from the Secretary, who has been unbelievably supportive of my role, while at the same time, as the President has said, we are not micromanaging these companies. This is a very narrow, limited role that I am engaged in. So that's one assignment that I juggle these days with a second assignment, quite different in scope, magnitude, and source, but similar in that conventional thinking won't work. BP. Now, it's altogether different from pay. The administration and BP, on their own, I had nothing to do with it, decided to set up an alternative mechanism for resolving BP claims. BP agreed voluntarily, no legislation. This is a voluntary compact. BP agreed to put up $20 billion to pay claims arising out of the spill. And BP said, if $20 billion is insufficient, and I hope it is sufficient, but if it's insufficient, BP will honor all supplementary financial obligations in the Gulf. So now I have this assignment of designing, implementing, and administering a $20 billion escrow fund designed to pay eligible claims. And that fund will, I believe, I'm recommending, will be a fund that will last for 3 years. And during that 3-year period, I will evaluate, analyze, determine independently what individuals, businesses, small businesses, large businesses in the Gulf impacted by the spill should receive. Now, I'm totally independent. I do not answer to the administration nor to BP. It's very, very clear when I spoke and accepted this assignment from the administration and from BP that I am an independent actor. This is a program that everybody voluntarily can enter into. They don't have to. Any fisherman, any businessman, any real estate owner, any motel, any crabber, oyster harvester, food processor, anybody can decide, I want nothing to do with this. I'd rather go to court or implement my other legal rights. Go ahead. You're crazy to do so, though. Go ahead if you want. Because under this program, you will receive, if you're eligible, you will receive compensation without having to go to court for years, without the uncertainty of going to court, since I'll be much more generous than any court would be. And at the same time, you won't need to pay lawyers and costs. So you ought to come into this program, and until you know exactly what you'll get to the penny, you're under no obligation to waive any right you might have to litigate against BP. In fact, as I've announced, anybody who needs money immediately who's eligible can come in and immediately receive a check for 6 months, emergency payment. You have to prove it, but you'll get 6 months payment without any release. If you decide after that to litigate, you still keep the check. I mean, who wouldn't come into this program and take that which is offered with no obligation, and then at the end of the day, when you're offered a lump sum payment for all present and future injury, calculated by the administrator, only then, when you know that amount, do you decide whether or not you want to take it in lieu of going to court. It is, to my way of thinking, an easy call. But do not underestimate the problems associated with human nature. I've seen it over and over again. Do not assume everybody sees these funds, 9/11, Virginia Tech, Agent Orange, this one. Do not assume that people automatically will opt into these programs. People are skeptical, angry, dispirited, worried about their financial certainty, their financial future. Human nature being what it is, you have to sell these programs, and that's why I've been spending so much time in the Gulf. You cannot do this program from Washington. Impossible. You got to go down there to Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi. I've received tremendous support from the governors of those states. I've received support from the attorneys general. I was on the phone the other day with Attorney General McCollum in Florida. Very helpful. I plan to meet with the attorneys general this week or next to meet with them to talk about their concerns. I am not adversarial to the people in the Gulf. I'm trying to distribute the money. At the same time, I'm trying to corral the claims, you see, so the courts don't get inundated with cases. There are certain tragedies in American life where public policy seeks a creative alternative to conventional thinking. And that's what pay is about, and that's what BP is about. Now, with BP, let me just give you 2 hurdles to success, substantive hurdles. 1, How attenuated will you allow the claims? Mr. Feinberg, I own a restaurant in the north end of Boston. I have the best shrimp scampi in the city. I can't get Gulf shrimp. Where's my money? Highly unlikely. At some point, you have to say, as a matter of public policy and law, claims are so attenuated, they can't be compensated. Mr. Feinberg, I own a motel on the beach. There's oil there, and I've lost customers. Pay the claim. I own a golf course 50 miles from the Gulf. I'm down 30%. People aren't coming to play golf. Dubious. But where do you draw that line? That's a judgment call, and you look to the law, Pollution Control Act, but the law only helps you so much. At some point, you have to make a call. So one challenge I've got, these claims are eligible. These claims are not eligible. Judgment. I could be wrong. You people could draw the line somewhere else. That's one problem. Problem number two is a corroboration problem, a problem of proof. Mr. Feinberg, I was making $5,000 a month as a fisherman. Now I can't fish. Pay me $5,000. Okay. What do you have to corroborate? Corroborate? What do you mean? Prove. It was a cash business. Nothing illegal about a cash business. What's your proof that you were making $5,000? Do you have a tax return? I lost it. Okay, you lost your tax return. Okay. Do you have a profit and loss statement? Do you have checkbook, check stub, something? No, I don't. No, I have no paper. Will the ship captain vouch for the $5,000 a month? I mean, I cannot just pay claims. You've got to prove your claim. I can be very lenient as to the proof. There's nothing illegal about a cash business, but I've got to have proof. And, fishermen, you're getting a 1099. The law requires it. Well, you see, you create barriers to participation, which is unfortunate. And you got to try and work with people. That's a challenge, to get people to come into a fund like this. So that is sort of just a brief summary. We could spend a seminar on both pay and BP. But what's important about both of these, and Agent Orange, and Virginia Tech, and the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund, which was an absolute horror to administer 11 weeks after the tragedies. What's the common denominator of all of these programs is out-of-the-box thinking. Don't be circumscribed by traditional ways of resolution. Don't assume that there's only a linear, one way to do these things. That's not true. With these assignments, it's creativity, it's practicality, it's coming up with incentive-based alternatives that will voluntarily channel people into a better way, win-win, of resolving these public policy dramas that come up. I believe that thanks to the Secretary and the help of Neil Wolin and the people at Treasury, I think that the executive compensation approach, in a very narrow realm, worked. It really did. It worked. And I think also that the BP program, once it's up and running next month, it'll work. It'll work because you create creative ways to voluntarily entice people to participate with very, very little downside risk. And that's the challenge. So I think I want to thank all of you. You don't say no to my friend David, who has been a friend and an ally for many, many years. And I jumped at the chance to be here. This is a very, very distinguished group. I think substantively you understand better than most what I'm trying to do. And I welcome now the opportunity under David's approach. I follow his lead for Q&A. Thank you very much. Very good, Ken.
Now, Ken, when you first got into the business of alternative resolution decision-making, you were appointed by Judge Jack Weinstein in New York. How did you know him, and how did he know of you? And have you ever thought, had he not appointed you, what you'd be doing now?
I knew Judge Weinstein because we had both clerked for the same judge 35 years apart. So he's still sitting, Judge Weinstein. He's 88. He's still sitting in the Eastern District in Brooklyn. And he appointed me because he knew of my work for Senator Kennedy and thought that this would be the right assignment for me in dealing with the Vietnam veterans and with the Veterans Administration. Now, if he hadn't appointed me, would I have been just a lawyer and done other things? I assume I would have. Like all of you, like everybody in life. You can plan a little bit, but you never know the twists and turns and what will happen in your professional and personal life. So who knows what would have happened, but it worked out fine.
When you did the 9/11, that I assume was very emotionally grueling because you were dealing with an enormous amount of deaths. How long did it take you to ultimately to come up with the procedures? And when people got paid there, was it publicly known what each person got paid?
Took me about 6 months to come up with the procedures to pay almost 3,000 death claims, World Trade Center, airplanes, Pentagon, and about 2,300 physical injury claims, mostly respiratory claims. There weren't many traumatic injuries in 9/11. You either got out of those planes and buildings or you didn't. So it took us about 6 months to set up the procedures. The program ran by statute for 33 months. So all but 94 people came into the program.
And when you normally you've had legislation that would guide you about how you would do these kinds of things. You have no legislation in the BP situation. Do you need legislation, or do you need any guidance from any other authority?
Guidance is fine. Guidance I welcome. We don't need any legislation. This is a purely private compact between the administration, the Justice Department on one hand, and BP on the other, with the goal of setting up, delegating to an administrator, me, set it up, run it, pay it. And I've asked for and received a good deal of input, suggestions as to how best to do this, but ultimately it's my call.
And you're now taking over a procedure that BP had already implemented. Could you explain what they were doing before, and does any money distributed before, and who does a lot of the staff work? How many people will you have working for you?
I give BP some credit here. I mean, BP has paid out on its own, pre-me, about $200 million in claims, mostly, but not completely, wage loss claims, a few business claims as well. BP, which is not generally in the claims processing business, has tried its best. They've retained contractors. There are roughly 1,600 people working in 35 offices throughout the Gulf, processing claims, receiving claims. All of that will transition in the next few weeks to the Gulf Coast Claims Facility, which I will administer, and we will continue to accelerate claims. Hopefully, emergency claims will be paid within a couple of days of requesting emergency funds, and thereafter, over the next 3 years, we'll process claims. A challenge is going to be, long-term injury. Fishermen, you have a fishing boat. I think that you'll be unable to fish for a year, so here's a lump sum check. No, I think I won't be able to fish for 5 years. If you think that, don't take the check. Go about your business and litigate or do what you will.
Suppose somebody does take a check. They think they're going to be out of business or harmed for a year, and then it turns out that it was more than a year. Can they come back, or do you have to make one check and that's it? That's all they get?
Don't come back. If you sign this release, you're releasing your right to come back. But, A, if you don't think that the period that I'm covering in this check is worthwhile, A, don't take it. You haven't lost any rights. B, come back next year. The fund's going to be in existence for 3 years. So come back next year, and you'll have a better feel for this. Or C, take the check. and I think this is a generous check. I've checked, I've looked around, I've asked people, we think you'll be able to fish or what have you. That is entirely voluntary, and entirely it's up to you.
Now, in 9/11, did you review every single payment, and will you be reviewing every single payment here?
I signed off on every single payment, and I will do so here. Now, when you sign off on these payments, that doesn't mean that every single individual or every single business crosses my desk. You come up with a methodology. You know about this: economic loss, lost profits, business interruption claims. You come up with a methodology for shrimpers, for charter boats, for motels, for restaurants. And that methodology must be consistent. You can't be biased in favor of one or another. You've got to apply the same methodology. So once you start streamlining this process, it becomes relatively easier to resolve these claims, because basically you have a process in place that is systematic and consistent. The other problem you've got to worry about is fraud. Nothing undercuts the credibility of these programs more than fraud. In 9/11, we had 7,300 applications. 35 were fraudulent. Fabulous. We had checks. We watched it. Internal and external auditing. With BP, I've got the help of the criminal division of the Department of Justice. Very, very important. And we'll have internal auditing and investigatory procedures. Now, the final point you make on your last question: will everybody in the public know in 9/11 or in BP, is all of this information public? Of course not. Of course not. If I disclosed to government, state, local, federal, the names of every individual, their address, how much they received, nobody would sign up for these programs. This is private, individual, proprietary information. I'll provide some general statistics, aggregate statistics, about the claims, how long it takes, how much money's been distributed, or for what types of claims. But the individual information must remain private and confidential. Otherwise, people will not. You mean to tell me my information is going to Washington, to the Internal Revenue Service, or to the? Absolutely not. It would be a huge barrier to voluntary participation.
And how long, how many people will it take to administer the BP program? You have hundreds of people to help process these claims?
Well, we subcontract out. Right now, as I said, BP hired 1,600 people in the Gulf. I don't think we need that many people. Once we systematize, you're going to be able to file a BP claim entirely online. If you want, electronically, never even go to a claims office. So we'll streamline and systematize the process. We're in the process of doing that now. BP didn't do that. BP was putting Band-Aids on the problem, as you would expect in an emergency situation. The best news, for my purposes, in the last week, is that the oil stopped. Until the oil stops, it's very hard to corral the claims. You don't know how many claims, whether the oil will reach a certain area. Now that the oil has apparently been stopped, or the leak is stopped, it'll make it a lot easier and quicker to get a handle on the universe of claims.
Now, on the 9/11 situation, that you did that pro bono, and how were you able to spend that much time pro bono? You do have to make a living. You just gave that as a gift to the country?
I gave it as a gift to the country, but let's be a little bit more pragmatic. When I did the 9/11 fund, I was a special government employee, as I am now with TARP. So I'm not an official government employee. I'm allowed in both 9/11 pro bono and TARP pro bono to maintain a private practice while at the same time working in these public policy areas. So I was allowed to benefit from my law firm practice. I didn't practice very much, but to benefit from my law firm practice while at the same time taking on these assignments.
Now, in BP, if somebody has insurance, it's a business or an individual have insurance, and they come for you for a claim and you pay them, can they still collect insurance, or that you don't care about their insurance?
I certainly do care. It's an offset to make them whole if they've received money from their insurer, especially if they've received state assistance. unemployment compensation, for example. Use that as an example. Mr. Feinberg, I was earning $5,000 a month. I've received $800 a month from the state of Alabama. How much can I get? You can get $4,200. We're going to offset the $800 that you've already received from your insurer. Now, your insurer, the state, certainly has a subrogation claim to recoup the $800, and we'll deal with that.
So if somebody comes to you for a claim and subsequently, a year later, they file for insurance, you wouldn't know about that, no?
It's too late. You've been paid, and if you got your insurance later, well, good luck to you.
Of all of the assignments you've taken in this area, what would you say has been the most difficult to get your hands around, and what was the most emotionally grueling?
Oh, they're all emotionally grueling. The 9/11 fund was a horror because Congress passed that law 11 days after 9/11. So you were dealing with people distraught. Mrs. Jones, I'm here to give you $2 million. You're here to give me $2 million. Mr. Feinberg, they haven't recovered my husband's body from the World Trade Center, and you're here to offer me money? How dare you offer me money? I want my husband back. 9/11, do not, BP, do not underestimate when you go down there. Mr. Feinberg, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm a 6th generation oyster harvester. And my oyster harvesting days are over. Now, what are you going to do for me, Mr. Feinberg? How can money possibly replace the heritage that my family built up here in the Gulf? This job, all of these assignments, require a certain perspective, emotional perspective, on what people are going through. And no matter how creative you may be in coming up with a program that reasonable people would claim is very reasonable and makes a lot of sense, you still got to sell it to people who are emotionally distraught. And that is a big part of what I have to do here.
Now, when you are the most famous, up until recently, I guess, the most famous person who came from Brockton, Massachusetts. Rocky Marciano also came from there. But does everybody else from there speak with that same accent that you have?
Last week in the Gulf, I told somebody in Biloxi, Mississippi, that I speak like a Southerner, a South Bostoner. And I think most people who live in Brockton and in Massachusetts, some of you are from Massachusetts, you know, we sort of cultivate the accent. It sort of comes in handy.
And where did you get your love of classical music and opera?
There's really an interesting story of my love of classical music. When I was 9 years old, I began studying in Brockton for my bar mitzvah. And the cantor...
4 years early.
Yeah, well, I was a slow learner. And the cantor in my synagogue in Brockton was an emigre from Vienna and a world-class expert on opera and classical music. And again, just serendipitous, he got me interested as a youngster in opera, and in some of these assignments, opera and classical music saved my sanity, I can tell you that.
And is it true you have a room in your house where it's for play classical music at great volumes, and this is how you relax now?
It's one way. I've got a music. I've got technologically. I've got a nice system with thousands of operas and CDs and classical music. I mean, some people read, some people go play softball. There's a lot. Go to the movies. You do what works best for you in terms of trying. 9/11, I must have gone to the Kennedy Center or to Carnegie Hall or the Metropolitan Opera 3 nights a week. Otherwise, you'd go mad doing these assignments. And you've got to find some outlet. And that
have you ever considered going on to the opera as a performer? Or you're not yet?
Well, now that you're the head of the Kennedy Center, David,
then we can make arrangements.
You'll see.
All right.
You'll see.
We'll work that out. We have some time for some questions from our guests, and so I don't know if there are mics out there, but if people, I don't have any cards, but Anybody raise your hands if you have some questions? Here's a question right here. Thank you.
Alan Burton from George Mason University. Ken, what did you learn from the Victims' Compensation Fund most relevant to what's going on in BP?
What you learn from all of these assignments, including BP, is how diverse human nature is. The reaction of people is as diverse as human nature itself. Some people are angry, some people are skeptical, some people are uncertain, some people are incredibly hopeful. Thank goodness you're here to help. One size does not fit all, and you better be prepared for a wide range of emotional reactions to what you're trying to accomplish.
Okay. Other questions? Here's a question right here.
Ralph Everett.
So Mike?
Ralph Everett of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. Do you think that $20 billion will be adequate?
Well, I hope $20 billion will be adequate. The good news is that BP has publicly stated that if it is inadequate, they will continue to honor all additional financial obligations that confront them. I hope it's adequate, but remember, the $20 billion is not just for me and the private program. Out of that $20 billion comes government claims. So, depending on the size, eligibility, scope of those government claims as well for cleanup, that $20 billion is all-encompassing. So we'll just have to play it out over the next few months. We'll get a much better handle if the oil's gone. Stop the leak. We'll get a much better handle on the claims, and then a lot will depend on where I define the eligibility criteria, how many people come in to prove their claim. We'll have to play it out. I hope it's enough.
Ken, you said at 9/11, I think 54 people chose not to go through.
94.
94 chose not to go through your process. How did those people actually fare in the litigation system? Do you know?
94 people opted out of the program. 3% opted out of the program, and all of their cases were settled.
And so you don't know whether they did financially better or worse? Nobody knows. Or...
No one knows, but I'm sure they didn't do as well. Not after they went to all that trouble, waited that many years, paid their lawyer, costs of litigating. I can't believe they did as well.
And do most of the people in the 9/11 case, did they hire lawyers when they came into your system? And will the people who come into the BP process need lawyers or not?
They don't need lawyers. They're more than welcome to have lawyers. I like lawyers. I'm a lawyer. If you want a lawyer, by all means, have a lawyer, really. But in the 9/11 fund, the ATLA, the American Association of Trial Lawyers, stepped up and provided pro bono lawyers for 1,500 people. I think we'll have some sort of pro bono program in BP as well if you want a lawyer.
Can you please describe the infrastructure or the team that you need to build to administer the BP fund? Where do you get these people? How do you subcontract, so forth?
Well, I've received a fair number. I'm a very popular guy these days from vendors interested. You've got to hire people locally, really. I got a letter from Senator Vitter the other day from Louisiana. Ken, I hope the $20 billion will go in local banks in the Gulf. You hire local people who are trusted by the community in terms of receiving the claims, sitting with them, helping process the claim, evaluate it. So we've hired or BP hired a claims adjuster firm from Hammond, Louisiana, that's has spread out over the Gulf. So as we're setting up the infrastructure now, I'm focused primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on local people. I met with the mayor of New Orleans a couple of weeks ago. He's great. Ken, it's great. We're sure you're going to do a good job. We want your headquarters here in New Orleans. That's where you should be headquartered. And Senator Landrieu and Governor Riley and Governor Barber and others have Governor Jindal, all very, very helpful, but all urging higher local, higher local, higher local.
In your TARP role, how did you find the executives when they were pleading for additional compensation or not to be cut back? Were they effective generally or not in their pleas to you?
I think they were effective. They weren't pleased. I think they were fairly effective. I didn't deal with too many CEOs. Some. Bob Ben-Moshe came to see me every other day, but he was pretty effective. Mostly you dealt with vice presidents for human resources. You dealt with general counsels. You dealt with consultants. We worked it out. It was difficult, but I think it was fairly collegial. People read the statute. They saw what I had to do, and I think it worked out. It worked out okay. Treasury was particularly helpful. Neil Wolin, the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, was sort of at my request. I would go and see him, and Neil was just and the Secretary very, very helpful in this whole project.
Ken, is the $20 billion escrow fund, is that safe from claims from other BP creditors? And in the case of that, what do you do with that $20 billion while you're waiting to pay the claims? Is it sitting there, or is it to be invested in anything, or is it just not yet actually in an escrow?
Is this the Carlyle Group asking this question?
I'm sure we could get a good return for it, but...
It's not on my watch. It's interesting. The escrow fund, the $20 billion, I'm just drawing on it. I don't know, as we sit here today, I think the administration and BP have still not finalized the escrow. So I can't really give you answers to those questions because that's beyond my jurisdiction. I'm going to draw on those monies, but I'm not a custodian of those funds. I don't really have much of a say right now in the terms and conditions of the fund.
And as you know, there are some views that not just BP might have been at fault, some of the people who constructed the rigs and so forth, but that's nothing that you're worried about, and other companies may have to contribute to this $20 billion, or those people will deal with BP separately?
I have nothing to do with anybody but BP. Clearly, those companies don't have to contribute. They may want to at some point, not on my watch. Somebody who comes into this voluntary program and gets a check from the fund is not releasing anybody but BP, an ultimate check. Remember, the emergency money, you don't even have to release BP. An incentive to come into the program and corral the claims. So we'll see what others do. Right now I'm focused on setting up the program, trying to get as many people as possible to participate, give them emergency payments without any obligation at all. And only downstream, when you file for a lump sum check, will you then make a decision whether you want that check in return for releasing BP only, or whether you want to reject the check and litigate.
And were you approached first by BP and almost simultaneously by the administration? How did that come together?
BP, twice, 2 meetings with BP, and then, rather suddenly, within 2 weeks, the administration, through Justice Department, Tom Pirelli, the Associate Attorney General, Justice has been fabulous here. They've been very, very cooperative in trying to set this program up. Tom was the point man, and those are the people I've dealt with. I haven't dealt with anybody at the White House. It's been Tom Pirelli and the Associate Attorney General's office at Justice, and it's been BP in Houston, and Tom Milch at Arnold and Porter here in Washington.
And Ken, can you describe your role earlier when you were working for Senator Kennedy? You're now the head of the Kennedy Library, is that right?
Right.
And in that capacity,
my day job.
Your day job. And in that role, you're doing what with the Kennedy Library? It's the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's inauguration is coming up.
That's right. The JFK Library Foundation. I'm the chairman of the board of the foundation. The library, of course, is a national presidential library funded by the taxpayer, but there's a foundation that I chair, probably about 60 members of the board, designed to perpetuate the legacy of President Kennedy. And the 50th anniversary is coming up. There are various projects underway. There's going to be a great event, thanks to you and others, at the Kennedy Center, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the election of President Kennedy. And our charge there is to sort of perpetuate the legacy and the memory of what President Kennedy stood for the country.
All right, my last question will be, Ken, do you ever have any self-doubt? You seem to be a very confident person. Have you ever, self-doubt ever one of your emotions?
These assignments, you better have a great deal of self-doubt. I mean, you're up at 3 a.m. trying to figure these things out. Self-doubt and criticism, public criticism, goes with the territory. Because if I'm right that you got to think out of the box, and you got to be a little bit different in the way you approach these problems, so you don't have a whole lot of precedent to guide you. Very, very important that you have that self-doubt. Very, very important that you reach out to as many people as you need to get ideas. Bounce ideas off people. That's why with 9/11, John Ashcroft, the Attorney General, fabulous. Help me on that. Virginia Tech, President Steger at Virginia Tech. Pay, Secretary Geithner and Neil Wolin. Bounce ideas. At my request, they don't go interfering. They're there if I want help. And now BP, Justice Department, BP, the Attorneys General, the governors, Haley Barbour, Ken, I have one bit of advice for you. Get the money out. Time is the enemy. Time is the enemy. Very, very sound advice. So self-doubt goes with the territory. It's a good thing. Just make sure it doesn't paralyze you. At some point you make a decision. Others may make it differently. You make that decision, move on.
Ken, on behalf of other Americans, I don't speak for the whole country, but I do want to thank you for what you've been doing for our country and in helping in this resolution and on the 9/11 matter. And on behalf of the members of the club, I want to thank you very much for coming today. Thank you. Thank you very much.